Hi there guys, got a video here for you today on the AGT Manul, and what I'm going to be doing in today's video is fully disassembling the pistol, then I'll be putting it back together once again. Now to be honest with you, there is no real reason why I need to disassemble the pistol. It's working absolutely flawlessly, but I do want to take a look at what's inside, and I thought some of you would be interested to tag along. With that said, I'm not recommending anyone modify or disassemble their pistol. I'm just doing it because I want to. With that said, the first thing I need to do is make sure the rifle is safe to work on by first cocking the rifle, then firing it into a nice safe backstop. All that does is make sure that there's not a pellet loaded into the barrel. The next thing we can do is degas the pistol. To do that, the first thing I'm going to do is remove the grip, starting off by removing the bottom plate. Then I can come along with a 5mm Allen key and remove the pistol bolt. Here we have that. I'll stick that safely over to one side. Then what I need to do is remove the hammer spring from the back here. To start off with, I'm going to be loosening the hammer spring lock nut, so this piece here. That's done with a 1.5mm Allen key. Then I can use a 4mm Allen key to remove the hammer spring adjuster. And that's just that piece there. With that removed, I can tip the hammer spring out. Then I can bring over my air release pin. So this is a part that you get in the box when you buy the pistol. So you should have one of these in your box. And what I'm going to do with this is just drop that into the back of the action, making sure it gets seated into the back of the hammer, which it is there. Then I can take my hammer spring adjuster and reinstall that into the rear. What I'm going to do here is just screw in with the hammer spring adjuster until I feel the pin contact with the hammer, and then the hammer will contact with the valve. After this, I can just screw in nice and gently until I hear the pistol start to hiss, at which point I can just let it degas. Once the hissing has stopped and the gauge on the end of the pistol has reached 0, we can remove the hammer spring adjuster as well as the air release pin. Up next, we're going to be removing the air cylinder from the front of the pistol, and to begin with, we're going to be removing the shroud on top of the barrel. To do that, what I'm going to do is insert a small Allen key through this hole here. Then we can remove the end cap. This is the threaded adapter, although the pistol does come fitted with a blank in the end there, which you're going to need to remove using a 7mm Allen key. With that removed, we can remove the shroud from the front there and put that safely over to one side, at which point we can then unscrew the air cylinder from the front. With that done, we can put the action over to one side. We'll fully disassemble this in a minute, but to begin with, we're going to be starting off with the air cylinder. Moving on to the air cylinder, the first thing I want to mention is that there is a small O-ring around the base of these threads here, and that seals on the front of the block. So if you have a leak emanating from the joint of these two components, it's more than likely going to be that O-ring. We'll put the block over to one side. And the first thing we're going to be doing is removing this end cap here. We can do that using a 7mm Allen key, just inserting that into this hole here. Then we can unscrew the back cap. The back cap itself houses the regulator, and we'll be pulling that out very shortly. Here we have the back cap, and then the regulator can be removed. We're just pulling this out nice and carefully. So that is our regulator. I don't know if you can see it or not, but from the factory there's 90 written on the side of the regulator, so we'll see how close that is very shortly. On the back cap for the cylinder, we do also have this O-ring around here, and that seals on the inside of the cylinder and stops air from leaking through the threads. So if you have a leak emanating from the joint of these two components here, it's most likely going to be that O-ring there. Moving on to the other end of the cylinder, first thing we're going to do is just pull this end cap off here. Then we can use a tight fitting punch through the hole there, and this punch is a 6mm punch. Then we can unscrew the end. And that's our cylinder. So the cylinder has a direction. If we take a look at the back here, we have a small bleed hole, and that goes to the rear of the cylinder, aligned with the end that the reg comes out of. So the regulator should be in the rifle, something like that. The end cap itself has an O-ring around the base which seals on the inside of the cylinder, and again, if you have air leaking out of the joint of these two components, it's more than likely this O-ring here. There is also another O-ring around the base of the threads, although this O-ring here isn't a sealing O-ring, it simply captures the cap for the end. And again, the cap itself does also have an O-ring in here, but again, that's not a sealing O-ring. The next thing we're going to do is remove the gauge. We're going to be doing that using a 19mm spanner. I'll use my punch, insert that into the hole, then we can remove the gauge itself. So the gauge, again, has another O-ring on the base there, and that just seals the base of the gauge against the front cap. So if you have air leaking around your gauge, it's going to be that O-ring there. The last piece of the puzzle is a small one-way valve in the housing, so that piece there, I'm not going to remove it for the purpose of this video. However, all that is a countersunk bolt with an O-ring beneath it. Air can travel through this way as it pushes the O-ring out of the way. However, air cannot go back through that hole as the actual air pressure itself compresses the O-ring and seals it against the base there. But there we have it. But if you did want to remove it, you could simply use a T10 Torx bit and just unscrew it. I'll remove it just for the camera. I don't normally bother removing these things, as unless they actually go wrong, you don't need to touch them, but some of you may be interested to see what it looks like. So it's just a countersunk bolt with an O-ring round it. If this O-ring had failed, you would have a small and continuous leak emanating from the fill port, and you'd simply need to use a T10 Torx bit to remove the screw, then replace the O-ring. But we'll put all this to one side and then take another look at the regulator. The regulator itself looks pretty much identical to the one found in the Eurogan 2. I'm not quite sure if that is identical. I don't have a Eurogan 2 regulator on hand. However, I will say it does fit in my Eurogan 2 regulator tester, so we can see what the actual reg is set to. It says 90 on the side. So it's reading about 87 on the gauge at the moment. However, that will change if we cycle the reg. Then after a couple cycles, it's settling around 88 bar. That is something I really like about the AGT rifles. The regulators seem to work absolutely fantastically. So the regulator itself is working absolutely flawlessly. 87.5 on the gauge there. Right then, so I've left the regulator pressurized up for about 10 minutes now, and as you can see, the gauge on the top there still reading 87.6. So there's pretty much no creep on that regulator whatsoever. I am really quite impressed with the AGT regulators. My AGT Vulcan did pretty much the same thing as did the Eurogan 2. With that done, the next thing we can do is depressurize the regulator, and then we'll take it apart. Right then, starting off with the regulator, you can see that the regulator body has two O-rings around it, one at the front, one at the back. If either one of these O-rings has failed, you'll have a small and constant leak emanating from this hole in the side of the cylinder. With that said, the next thing I'm going to do is just take a measurement across the entire length of the regulator. And what we're doing here is measuring the actual position of the adjuster screw in the end here. So on my one, that's about 53.7, and that equates to around 88 bar. What we're trying to do is establish the distance between the two faces so that when we go to rebuild the regulator, we can set that to the same distance and the regulator pressure should be roughly the same. With that said, the next thing we're going to do is flick the regulator up and remove this snap ring from the base here, just using some internal snap ring pliers. With that removed, we can then remove the piston from the middle by screwing in an M4 bolt into the base of the piston, then holding the regulator body up and gently pulling the piston out from the bottom. Be nice and careful as you do that, as there is a number of Belleville washers stacked onto the regulator piston, so just make sure you don't lose them as you take that out. This is the Belleville stack on my particular piston, so I'll just get you a quick look at that there, and we'll put that down to one side. The next thing we can do is remove the adjuster screw from the end. To begin with, what we're going to be doing is using a 17mm spanner to hold the body. Then we can use a 10mm spanner to loosen the locking nut. With the lock nut loose, we can come through with a 4mm Allen key and then remove the adjuster screw. And there we have it. There's the regulator fully disassembled. So I'll just run through what each of the regulator O-rings does, then we can move on. Right then, so starting off with the regulator adjuster screw, this has a seal on the bottom here, and if this O-ring has failed, the regulator itself will have an excessive amount of creep. So regulator creep is defined as any increase in pressure once the regulator has reached its set point. The regulator body has two O-rings around the outside, and as we said earlier, if either one of those have failed, you'll have air leaking out of this hole here. The piston itself does have another two O-rings on it, and if either one of these O-rings here has failed, again you'll have air leaking out of this hole in the side of the cylinder. The last seal in the regulator is a mechanical seal between these two components here, so the adjuster screw tip and the tip of the regulator piston. When the rifle is pressurized and ready to take a shot, the system itself is sealed, so high pressure air can't enter the regulator chamber. As we take a shot, the piston itself deseats from the adjuster screw and allows high pressure air from the cylinder to enter the regulated air chamber. As soon as the regulated air chamber pressure reaches our set pressure, the piston itself touches the adjuster screw and stops air from moving forward through the system. If you have a bad seal between these two components here, you'll have excessive amounts of regulator creep. The easiest way to tell if your regulator has creep on it without using a regulator tester is to simply fire the rifle over a chronograph after you've left the rifle sit for about 15 or 20 minutes. If your first shot or first couple of shots is excessively high or excessively low, then your regulator may have creep on it. With that all said, we'll put the regulator over to one side and bring back the block. Right then, with that all done, we can move over to the main block. The first thing we're going to be doing is removing the valve from the front of the pistol. To do that, what I'm going to be using is an M2.5mm bolt. We're going to be inserting that into the valve cover, so just screwing that in nice and lightly, just until it stops by hand. Then we can very gently wiggle the cap loose. The cap itself does have a small O-ring around the body of it, and what this does is stop regulator pressure from leaking out past the cap, and if this O-ring has failed, you'll have a small leak emanating from this hole here. We still do have the firing valve in the pistol body, which we can tip out nice and gently. So there's the firing valve. The firing valve itself does have a sealing face on it, which is this face here. This face seals within the block. The valve face itself seals off regulator pressure from being able to escape up the barrel. As we take a shot, the hammer knocks the valve off from its seat, and then air is able to travel through the barrel. Then regulator pressure builds up behind the valve and closes it once again. If you have a constant leak of air from the barrel itself, it's more than likely going to be your firing valve. With that said, we can put the valve over to one side, then begin on the rest of the block, starting off with the barrel and the mag. To begin with, the barrel can be removed by loosening these two grub screws here using a 2.5mm Allen key. With those two loose, we can just pull the barrel out. The barrel on this particular rifle is a 177 unchoked CZ barrel. The next thing we can do is remove the magazine by first opening the pellet probe, then removing these two screws here using a T6 Torx bit. If the screw is loose, we can just use a pair of tweezers to pull them out from the body. Then we can slide the mag out. So I'll put that over to one side. And the next thing we'll do is remove the pellet probe. Starting off, we can loosen and remove these two screws here using a 2mm Allen key. These will have a small amount of blue Loctite on them from the factory, so just be nice and careful as you remove them. And then with that done, we can just lift the cocking arm off and put that safely over to one side. Up next, we can use a 3mm Allen key just to remove these two studs here. And again, they will have a small amount of blue Loctite on them from the factory. You could probably leave this bottom one in, but I'm going to be taking out just for the purpose of the video. Up next, we're going to be using a T10 Torx bit to remove this screw in the top here. And then I'm going to be using a nice soft plastic O-ring pick just to push this plastic piece forward into the magazine area. The plastic piece itself is quite stiff within the block, so just be nice and careful as you remove it. But there we have it there. Removing this piece gives us access to the top of the pellet probe, and the next thing we're going to be doing is removing this screw here using a 1.5mm Allen key. This will have a small amount of blue Loctite on it from the factory, so just be nice and careful as you remove it. And what I'm doing here is just going backwards and forwards just to break some of the Loctite between the threads. And then once we get free, we can just unscrew it normally. So there we have it there. This bolt here acts as our cocking dog and is what pushes the hammer back. With that done, the next thing we can do is remove the small spring ball detent from the rear of the pellet probe. To do this, what I'm going to be doing is pushing the pellet probe back until the ball bearing itself aligns itself with this hole in the back here. With that done, we can flip the block up, then very gently push the pellet probe back whilst having our hand beneath the piece. The ball bearing itself will fall out the back, then we can just move the pellet probe forward again, through the front, and then remove it. It will still have a small spring beneath here, but luckily it doesn't fall out on its own. With the pellet probe out, I will very briefly mention that the barrel itself does have a small transfer port O-ring in the end there, which seals around the pellet probe. So if you have a puff of air emanating from the barrel area every time you take a shot, you simply need to replace that O-ring there. Another symptom of this O-ring failing is that the rifle may be low on power. Right then, next thing I'm going to be doing is removing the trigger plate. To do that, I'm going to need to remove these three screws here using a T6 Torx bit. There we have it. I'll just give you a quick look at the trigger. So you can see it's a proper two-stage trigger with all the relevant adjustments, such as trigger weight adjustment, first stage travel, and then second stage creep, which is adjusted by the latching points of the two sears. I'll briefly run through the adjustments. So first here we have the trigger weight screw. Adjusting this in increases the trigger weight, adjusting it out decreases trigger weight. Next to that we have the first stage travel. Adjusting this in decreases first stage travel, adjusting it out increases first stage travel. The next adjustment we have is this one here. This adjusts the sear engagement and can be used to adjust the second stage creep. Adjusting this screw in will decrease the latching area of the two sears, and adjusting it out will increase the latching area of the two sears. I will say that if you improperly adjust this screw here, it can make the pistol unsafe. If you adjust it too far in, the pistol itself may not cock when you pull the cocking arm back, or, worst case scenario, when you cock the pistol, it may go off unexpectedly if you were to bump or knock the pistol. So I would advise either to leave it at the factory setting or adjust this very, very, very carefully. Having said that, if you feel like your trigger has a little bit of second stage creep, you could wind this screw in very, very carefully. Our final adjustment at the back here is simply the over travel on the sear. Under normal conditions you should never need to touch this as it's set from the factory. With that all said and done, the last thing we can do is remove the hammer as well as the hammer adjuster housing. To do that, we're going to be using a 1.5mm Allen key just to remove this locking screw. Then we can come through with an 8mm Allen key and remove the hammer adjuster housing. With that done, we can then remove the hammer. If we tip it all the way back, it should come out through the back of the action. And there we have our pistol hammer. With that done, that's pretty much the entire pistol fully disassembled. What I'm going to do now is just go through the pistol very quickly. There's some measurements that I want to take, and then when I've finished what I need to do, I'll bring you back and we'll put the pistol back together once again. Right then, so I've gone through and I've got all my measurements. The next thing we're going to be doing is putting the pistol back together again. So to begin with, we're going to be installing the hammer assembly as well as the trigger plate on the side here. To begin with, the first thing I'm going to do is lightly push down this sear at the back here, just so we can slide our hammer into place. That'll do for there. We'll take our hammer, slide that through the back of the action. Then we can pull the trigger to allow the hammer to fly all the way forward. With that done, we can take our hammer spring adjuster housing, then get that screwed into the back of the block. On this particular rifle, the adjuster housing was one turn in from flush, so that's where I've reset it to. The next thing we can do is take our lock screw and get that installed. We're not going to be doing this up tight, we just need to get it installed so that when we install the hammer spring adjuster, this piece doesn't turn in the block. Next, I'm going to be adding the trigger plate back to this side. So we're just going to be dropping that into position. Then I'll take the screws, get those lined up, and then we can do those up using a T6 Torx bit. Right then, up next we're going to be reinstalling the pellet probe assembly. So to start off with, we'll take our pellet probe, and I'm just going to be adding a small amount of lithium grease to the outside of the probe itself. Just a small amount will do us, we don't need tons on this component. Then what we need to do is find this little grub screw at the top here and align that with the top of the block. So just like so. We can then push that through the barrel transfer porthole, then push the probe all the way to the rear. With that done, the next thing I'm going to do is just add a small amount of grease to this hole at the very rear of the pellet probe, so just in this here. Then I'm going to add my spring, top that off with a tiny little bit more grease, and then drop our ball bearing on top of that. With that done, we can then push that forward, making sure that the ball bearing travels into the block. Then we can just push it until the detent latches on the hole, just there. With that done, we can just come in through the top once again, using a nice small Allen key just to bring the probe forward once again. And then what we can do is take this grub screw here, and what we're going to be doing to this is adding a small amount of blue Loctite to the top of the threads. Just a small amount will do us, we don't need tons. Then we can get that installed into the top here. Getting that done up with a 1.5mm Allen key. We just need the top of the grub screw to be flush with the pellet probe. So I'm just going to take a cotton bud, wipe the excess Loctite off, then just make sure that the grub screw is flush with the top of the probe. So I'm happy there. Up next, we're going to be taking this component here, and then again adding a small amount of blue Loctite to the threads. Then we can get that screwed into the side of the pellet probe. And again, I'm just going to be taking a cotton bud, wiping off the excess Loctite if any came out. Then what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of lithium grease to this slot in the side here. Again, I'm just putting a bit on, then we can wipe the excess off with, again, another cotton bud. Up next, I'll install the other pivot. And again, this is just going to get a small amount of blue Loctite around the threads. What I'm going to do then is just take my cocking arm here, add a small amount of lithium grease to both this hole at the back and to the slot itself. So just in the slot. Just a little bit on this component. I'm going to be wiping most of this off. That done, we can get that lined up with the pivot and the pellet probe. Then I'll remove any excess grease. Then get the two securing screws installed. Again, just a small amount of blue Loctite around these components. And we'll just make sure everything feels nice and smooth and reciprocates as it should. So that feels good to me. The last thing we can do here is just add the small plastic cover to the top, getting that lined up, then pushed into place. Then secured using the small screw. We can get that done up with a T10 Torx bit. Up next, we're going to be reinstalling the barrel and the magazine. So to start off with, I'm going to be installing the mag first. Need to pull the pellet probe back, slide the mag in, making sure that hooks nicely under the pellet probe. Then we can get that secured using the two screws, doing those up with a T6 Torx bit. Next up, we can get the barrel installed. What we need to do here is make sure the dimple in the top is aligned with the top of the block and the transfer port is aligned with the bottom. Once we have that established, we can take our barrel, slide that in through the front, just push it up to the magazine, then we can get the two grub screws done up with a 2.5mm Allen key. Up next, we're going to be reinstalling the valve and the valve cap. To begin with, we're just going to be taking a look inside the block and making sure there's no debris or anything on the valve seat itself. You could clean it out with something like a nice clean cotton bud, making sure there's no debris on the valve seat. We can then do the same on the valve, just making sure the face, this part here, is nice and clean and there is no debris. Once we're happy, we can take the valve, drop that into the hole, making sure that the valve stem travels through the middle of the block nicely. We can then take our cap and our O-ring and get that installed over the top. Before this goes in though, I am just going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring around the outside. I'm also going to be installing that on our M2.5 bolt. Then we can get that pushed in nice and gently. The O-ring itself is fairly tight within the block, so just be careful as you push that in. And I've also pushed it just a little further than flush. When we pressurise the pistol up, the valve cap will spring back, but it won't be able to fly out as the cylinder itself blocks the cap from coming out completely, so air pressure will push it exactly where it needs to be. Right then, next thing we're going to be doing is rebuilding our regulator. To start off with, I'm just going to go round and add a small amount of silicone grease to all of the internal O-rings. And then I'm just going to add a small amount of dry lube to the Belleville washers. Dry lube, as the name suggests, is just a dry lubricant, and it's just something I like to put on my Belleville washers to give them a little bit of lubrication when they're in the rifle. I don't like using oil or grease on the Belleville washers. However, using dry lube is totally optional. Some people don't like to use anything on the Belleville washers. I find it just makes them work just a tiny little bit better. But just a small amount of powder will do us. Then we can just make sure all the components are nice and free of debris and get those stacked back into the regulator body. To start off with, we're going to be adding our piston. And that just slides nicely in the bottom of the body. Push that into position just until it stops. The next thing we can do is add our circlip, so do that now. Put that into position, and then we can get that secured using the snap ring. So I'm just going to take my set of snap ring pliers, get the snap ring installed in the rear there. Then I'm just pushing it into position and making sure it's seated by rotating the snap ring. With that done, the next thing we can do is install our adjuster. So we'll put that in there, screw that into the body. And then with that done, we can reset our regulator adjuster screw position. On this particular rifle, or pistol I should say, it was set to 53.7 and that equated to a reg pressure of around 88 bar. So we're just going to reset it to there. There we have it, 53.7. The next thing we can do is get our lock nut done up nice and tightly. And to do that, we're going to be holding the body of the regulator in a 17mm spanner. Then we're going to be taking a 10mm spanner, just doing the lock nut up. With that done, I'm just going to recheck our measurement to make sure nothing has moved. As you can see there, it has moved very slightly, although to be honest with you, I'm not going to worry too much about that, as it was set at 88 bar to begin with, so it will probably be set around a 90 now. Up next, we'll reassemble the air cylinder. Starting off, we'll install the reg into the housing. To begin with, I'll add a small amount of silicone grease to both of these O-rings at the back here. Just a small amount will do us. Then we can get the reg slid into its housing. With that done, I'm going to take another amount of silicone grease and just add it to this O-ring here. I'm going to be fairly generous here, as this O-ring is fairly tight within the cylinder. So a nice amount of silicone grease on that component there. Then we can get it screwed into the cylinder. Now the regulator end needs to have the small breathe hole in the back there. So the regulator needs to be aligned with the breathe hole. Then we can use our 7mm Allen key and just get this done up nice and tightly. That done, we can concentrate on the gauge end. And the first thing I'm going to do is re-add our gauge. To begin with, I'll add a small amount of silicone grease to the O-ring. And we can get that screwed into the face there. And to do that up, I'm just using my 6mm punch through the fill hole and a 19mm spanner just to do the gauge up nice and tightly. Don't forget to replace the one-way valve if you took it out before. And then what I'm going to do is add another bit of silicone grease to this O-ring round here. Again, fairly generous with this as it is tight in the cylinder. We can then add this piece to the front of the cylinder. Getting it done in as far as I can by hand, then I'm going to be taking my 6mm punch and just doing it up. This doesn't need to be done up tight. What we need to do is gauge the fit by using the cap on the end here. So when it's in the correct position, the fill probe should be aligned with that hole there. So about there will do. Up next, we're going to be installing the cylinder, then the barrel shroud on top of that. So to begin with, we're going to be adding a small amount of silicone grease to this O-ring around the base of the threads. Then we can get the cylinder screwed into the front of the block. Getting that done up nice and tightly by hand. The next thing we can do is just check the position of our fill probe. So at the moment here it's at the top. That is okay, you can still get the probe in there. However, I like it round to the bottom. So I'm just going to very carefully move it round just like that. And that just allows me to get the fill probe in there a little easier. With that done, I'm going to take my barrel shroud, just slide that over the barrel. Align the 2 pins up in the block with the 2 holes in the shroud. Push that together, then top that off with this little thread adapter. Up next, I'm just going to be lightly installing the hammer spring and then the hammer spring adjuster. So to begin with, we'll drop the hammer spring in the back there. Just make sure that gets seated in the back of the hammer. Then we can add the adjuster. Just screwing that in very lightly. We can readjust the power once the rifle has been pressurized back up again. Before we connect our dive cylinder, we are going to cock the pistol. What this will do is remove any valve preload that the hammer may be placing on the valve. And with that done, the last thing we can do is get the pistol pressurized back up again. So I'm taking my filler probe, installing that into the front of the cylinder. Now before we begin, I will mention that as soon as we start filling, some air may leak out the end of the barrel. That's totally normal. All we need to do is continue filling, and then once the valve sees about 40 or 50 bar of pressure on the back of it, that should close and air will stop leaking out of the barrel. So we'll fill it and we'll see what happens. Right then, so I've got a bit of pressure in the pistol. As you can see there, I've filled it to 200 bar. And I'm not sure if the camera microphone would have picked it up or not, but we did hear a small leak of air from the barrel. But then as soon as the pistol got above 50 bar, that leak stopped, and now it's holding air quite nicely. If the leaking doesn't stop as you're filling the pistol, you may have to give the pistol a couple of dry fires in order to cycle the valve and seat it against its seat. If after 15 to 20 dry fires it doesn't seat, what you'll have to do is pull the cylinder back off again, remove the valve cap, and then check the valve. If the pistol has been disassembled, there may be a small amount of debris that's worked its way through the cylinder and got into the valve. If after you give everything a good clean out, the pistol still does not seal, you will have to take another close look at the firing valve, more specifically the dowel ring piece. What you may have to do is lightly polish the sealing face up with a nice fine piece of sandpaper in order to get it to seal again. What I would recommend doing is polishing the edge using something like 1200, then going up through the grits as fine as you can go. However, in most cases, the pistol itself should seal nice and quickly as you fill it. Right then, the last thing I've gone ahead and done is just reset the power of the pistol. To do that, all you do is adjust the hammer spring setting at the back here using a 4mm Allen key. This is a sub 6 foot-pound pistol, so I've gone ahead and set the pistol power to around 5.5 foot-pounds using JSB heavies. To increase the power of the pistol, you simply wind the hammer spring setting in to increase spring tension on the hammer. To decrease power, you simply wind it out. I will say, if you go too far in with your adjustment, what will happen is when you fire the pistol, the hammer will fly forward and it will actually stick the valve open. So it will dump all the air out the barrel. So if you are adjusting the power of the pistol, just make sure you keep that in mind, and then once you're happy with your setting, you just use a 1.5mm Allen key in the base here to lock the hammer spring adjuster in place. With that done, the last thing we can do is reattach our grip. To do that, we're just going to be putting the grip on the body. Then we can come along with our grip screw and get that installed in the bottom using a 5mm Allen key. And there we have it. There's the pistol fully rebuilt and in a working condition. To be honest with you, I am really impressed with the little AGT Manul. It's performed absolutely beautifully for me so far. The regulator is working absolutely perfectly, and I have no real complaints about the Manul. I think it's an absolute fantastic pistol, and I'm really looking forward to doing a few modifications to it. But with that said, that's pretty much going to do it for this particular video. So thank you very much for watching. I hope it's been interesting or useful, and I'll see you in the next one.